good to have you back for part 6 in our videos on using ashlar-vellum's graphite. In this series, we've drawn a simple part and learned about stroke commands. We've filleted and chamfered corners, added holes, and made changes to the drawing. Now we're going to dimension it. Later, we'll show you how to add cross-hatching, demonstrate stretching, and also rotating a part, and lastly, printing a drawing. It works the same way using either Mac or Windows. Dimensions in Graphite automatically go to the dimension layer rather than the work layer as long as the dimension layer is shown. Since layers are transparent, the geometry and dimensions are displayed on both layers at the same time. Should the dimension layer be hidden, the dimensions would be placed on the current work layer. First, we're going to dimension this diagonal line. To begin, click on the little arrow in the bottom right corner of the Dimensions tool. The palette flies out and stays open. Go to the button on the far end and press to tear off the palette from the main palette. I'd like this palette to run horizontally across my screen, so I'm going to use File, Preferences, come down to Dimensions Palette Orientation, and choose Horizontal. Then I can use the little box at the head of the palette to drag the palette to a convenient place on the screen. I don't recommend the bottom or the far right, as several tools have further subpalettes extending from them. I'm going to pick the horizontal dimension tool. The message line reads, Pick first dimension point. Select the left end of the line to be dimensioned by clicking the lower endpoint of the 45-degree line. The hotspot on the cursor moves to the right. Let's take a closer look at this. The dot on the leg of the pointer marks the hotspot for the performed action. The location of the dot indicates which side of the object to select. The dot changes position as the dimensioning tool is used. This type of cursor is a smart cursor, or sometimes called a smart pointer, because it gives important information in a multi-step process. Many of Graphite's tools use a smart cursor. Going back to our drawing, I'll now click the upper endpoint of the 45-degree line. Our dimension appears, but let's change the text. Move the cursor over the characters and the selection pointer appears. Drag the text to the left horizontally until it's about ½ an inch from the left leg of the dimension to reposition it. Next, we'll dimension the vertical edge to the base of the part. Select the Vertical Dimension tool. The message line reads, Vertical, pick first dimension point. It's important to note that the order of the selection determines the placement of the dimension text. Let me show you. By selecting in the order shown on the smart pointer, the text appears to the right of vertically dimensioned geometry. Selecting in the opposite order, the text appears to the left. For horizontal dimensions, select in the order of the smart pointer to put the text above the dimension, or in the opposite order to place it below. Back on our part, because we want the dimension on the left, I'll click the lowest point of the chamfered corner first, then click the upper endpoint of the vertical line. The dimension appears on the left. Now let's add some tolerances. Choose Dimension Linear from the top menu and select Stacked Limits. Down in the status line, we see new data fields. Click the word Upper, and the field highlights ready for me to type and go. Type 0.003 and press Enter. We now have a dimension with an upper tolerance of 3/1000ths and a lower tolerance of -1/1000. Now let's dimension the angle of the cutout. Select the Angular Dimension tool. The message line reads, Angular, select line. Click the arms of the cutout near the lower end of the lines on the outside of the part. But be careful not to click the endpoints themselves. The angle is measured from the endpoint nearest the location clicked. The placement of the angular dimension is controlled by which side of the midpoint is selected on each of the lines. There are 4 combinations. Let me show you quickly. If I instead click up here and up here, it gets this angle. Up here and down here does this one. Or up here and down here for this one. Now I'll add a radial dimension to the fillet by selecting the Radial Arrow Out Dimension tool. The message line reads, Radial Arrow Out. Select Arc or Circle. From the menu, choose Dimension, linear, and select standard dimensions. Make sure the on notation appears on the arc. Click outside but near the filleted corner. Radial dimensions are created with a single mouse click. The text appears on the side that was clicked. Now close the Dimension tool palette by clicking the button in the box at the palette's head. You can also use the Windows menu to display and close palettes. Finally, we're going to remove the angular dimension so that you can see how to do it. With the Selection tool active, click the text of the angular dimension and press Delete. Okay, let's save our file with a different file name, Part 1A, so that we'll be able to use it later for an advanced exercise. Use File, Save As, and after 1, I'll add an A to the file name and press Return. That's the basics of dimensioning in Graphite. Next, we'll cover cross-hatching, stretching, and rotating a part. So join me in the next video in this series. I'm Julie Bowe. Thanks for your interest.